The car had been parked on Magnolia Drive for 11 days before anyone complained. It was a 1997 Buick LeSabre, the color of faded burgundy, with rust spots on the fenders and a crack running diagonally across the windshield like a scar. The paint was peeling on the hood. One of the taillights was held in place with electrical tape. The back seat was piled with blankets and pillows and a few plastic bags, and the front passenger seat held a neatly folded coat, a thermos, and a small leather handbag that looked like it had been expensive once, a long time ago. Magnolia Drive was not the kind of street where a 1997 Buick LeSabre belonged. It was the kind of street where BMWs and Teslas and Range Rovers lined the driveways like polished soldiers in formation. Every house was worth at least $1 million. Every lawn was immaculate. Every mailbox was custom designed. Every family had at least 2 incomes, a retirement portfolio, and an opinion about property values that they were not shy about expressing. Magnolia Drive was in Briarwood Estates, a gated community in the suburbs of Charlotte, North Carolina, the kind of place where the Homeowners Association met once a month to discuss things like fence heights and garbage can placement, and whether the Hendersons' new deck color was within the approved palette. The kind of place where conformity was not just expected but enforced, where deviation from the norm was treated not as individuality but as contagion, something that could spread if not contained. And now there was a rusted Buick parked on the street with an old woman sleeping in it. Her name was Edith May Crawford. She was 81 years old. She had white hair that she kept pinned up in a style that hadn't been fashionable since the 1970s, but that she maintained with the stubborn consistency of a woman who had decided long ago what she looked like and saw no reason to change. Her face was creased with the deep, permanent lines of someone who had spent a lifetime in the sun, and her hands, which rested in her lap while she slept, were thin and spotted and slightly curled, like the pages of a book left open in the rain. She wore the same outfit every day, a lavender cardigan over a white blouse, gray slacks, flat shoes with rubber soles that were worn smooth from years of walking, a pearl necklace that sat against her collarbone, each pearl slightly yellow with age, held together by a clasp that she could still fasten without help. Though it took her longer now than it used to, she arrived every morning at 7:15. She parked the Buick in the same spot halfway between 412 and 414 Magnolia Drive on the public street that the residents considered private by virtue of proximity and entitlement. She turned off the engine, she adjusted her seat, she pulled a blanket over her legs, and she sat there all day. Sometimes she slept. Sometimes she read. Sometimes she just stared out the windshield at the house across the street. Number 417, a large colonial with white shutters and a red door and a garden that had been professionally landscaped by a company that charged $400 a visit. She stared at that house the way people stare at photographs of places they used to live, with longing, with memory, with a particular kind of grief that comes not from death, but from distance, from the knowledge that the place you loved still exists, but you can no longer reach it. Nobody spoke to her for the first 3 days. The residents of Magnolia Drive noticed her, of course. You can't park a rusted Buick on a street full of luxury cars without being noticed. But noticing and acting are different things. And in a neighborhood like Briarwood Estates, there is a protocol for dealing with anomalies. You don't confront them directly. You discuss them at the mailbox, over the fence, in the group text that someone had set up for the street 3 years ago, and that was used primarily for passive-aggressive commentary about landscaping choices and package theft. The messages started on day 2. Has anyone else noticed the old car parked near the Petersons' house? It's been there since yesterday morning. Is it broken down? There's someone inside it. An elderly woman. She appears to be sleeping. Should we call someone? Let's give it another day. Maybe she's visiting. By day 4, the tone had shifted. The car is still there. This is getting ridiculous. She's definitely living in it. I saw her brushing her teeth with a water bottle this morning. This is a gated community. How did she even get in? The gate's been broken for 2 weeks. I told the HOA this would happen. We pay $1,400 a year in HOA fees for security and maintenance. This is unacceptable. Someone needs to do something. By day 7, the group text had devolved into the kind of fevered, self-righteous outrage that only affluent suburbanites can produce. Accusations flew. The HOA president was blamed. The gate company was blamed. The old woman herself was blamed, as if the act of sleeping in a car on a public street were a personal attack on the collective dignity of Magnolia Drive. Theories multiplied. She was homeless. She was mentally ill. She was casing houses for a robbery. She was a squatter. She was someone's estranged mother. She was a danger. She was an eyesore. She was a problem that needed to be solved. Not one of these theories was generated by actually talking to her. Not one resident of Magnolia Drive, in 7 days of observing an 81-year-old woman sleeping in a rusted Buick, walked across the street and knocked on the window and said, "Ma'am, are you all right? Is there anything I can do?" Not one. On day 8, a petition was circulated. It was drafted by a man named Craig Fullerton, who lived at 410 Magnolia Drive, and who was the kind of person who expressed his anxiety about the world through the meticulous control of his immediate surroundings. His lawn was the greenest on the street. His hedges were the straightest. His trash cans were stored in a custom-built enclosure that matched the exterior paint of his house. He drove a white Lexus that he washed every Sunday morning, even in winter, even when it hadn't rained, even when the car was already clean. Craig's petition asked the HOA to invoke its authority to have the vehicle towed from the street. It was signed by 14 of the 22 households on Magnolia Drive. The remaining 8 either hadn't been home or hadn't cared enough to sign, which in Briarwood Estates amounted to the same thing. The petition was submitted to the HOA board. The board president, a retired corporate lawyer named Donald Waverly, reviewed it and determined that since Magnolia Drive was technically a public street, the HOA had no authority to tow a legally parked vehicle. This was a matter for the police, so on day 11, Craig Fullerton called the police. The officer who responded was a woman named Sergeant Rita Alvarez. She was 43 years old, a 20-year veteran of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, and she had the specific kind of patience that comes from 2 decades of dealing with people whose problems are, objectively, not problems. She had once spent 45 minutes mediating a dispute between neighbors over the volume of a wind chime. She had been called to a domestic disturbance that turned out to be a husband and wife arguing about whether to get a Labrador or a Golden Retriever. She had handled noise complaints about birthday parties, parking disputes over 6 inches of curb space, and a surprisingly heated confrontation about a misplaced recycling bin. She pulled her cruiser up behind the Buick and ran the plates. The car was registered to an Edith Mae Crawford, 81 years old, with a clean record. No warrants, no violations, no flags of any kind. She got out of the cruiser and walked to the driver's side. Window. Edith was awake. She was sitting behind the wheel with a book open on her lap. A paperback that looked like it had been read many times, the spine cracked and the pages soft with handling. She was wearing the lavender cardigan and the pearl necklace, and the expression of a woman who was not surprised to see a police officer at her window, as if she had been expecting this. As if she knew that the world she was parked in had rules about people like her, and that eventually those rules would be enforced. She rolled down the window. It took effort. The manual crank was stiff, and her hands were not what they used to be. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Sergeant Alvarez with Charlotte-Mecklenburg PD. We've received some complaints about a vehicle parked on this street for an extended period. Is everything all right?" Edith looked at her. Her eyes were sharp, clear. The kind of eyes that don't miss much and never have. The kind of eyes that can read a room or a person in seconds. "I'm fine, Sergeant. Thank you for asking. I know I've been here a while. I'm sorry for the trouble. Can I ask why you're parked here, ma'am?" Edith looked at the house across the street, number 417, the colonial with the white shutters and the red door. She looked at it the way she always looked at it, with longing, with memory. "That's my house," she said. Rita looked at the house. Then she looked at Edith. Then she looked at the house again. "Your house." It was. For 47 years. My husband and I built it in 1974. We raised our children there. We buried our dog in the backyard under the maple tree. I planted every flower in that garden myself. The roses along the fence, the hydrangeas by the porch, the lilac bush by the back door that blooms in May and smells like heaven. She paused. Her voice was steady but thin, the way old voices get when they're carrying something heavy. "I lost it 2 years ago, after Harold died." Rita didn't say anything for a moment. She stood there, beside the Buick, on a street that hummed with the quiet entitlement of wealth, and she listened to the kind of story that money can't fix and petitions can't solve. Harold Crawford had been Edith's husband for 54 years. They met in 1967 at a church picnic in Gastonia, where Harold was the new associate pastor and Edith was the choir director. He was 25. She was 22. He had a laugh that could fill a room, and a handshake that could crack walnuts, and a faith in God and people that never wavered, not even when both God and people gave him plenty of reasons to waver. They married in 1968. A small ceremony at the church, a reception in the fellowship hall with punch and homemade sandwiches, and a cake that Edith's mother had baked and decorated with fresh flowers from her garden. They had $40 between them on their wedding night. Harold said it was the richest he had ever felt. He became the senior pastor of Grace Community Church in Charlotte in 1971. It was a small congregation, maybe 100 families, in a neighborhood that was just beginning to grow. Harold built the church the way he built everything, with his hands and his heart, and the absolute conviction that if you do good work in a good place for good people, the rest will follow. He was right. The church grew, the congregation doubled, then tripled. Harold became a fixture in the community. He married couples. He baptized babies. He buried the dead. He visited the sick. He counseled the grieving. He showed up at every hospital bedside, in every funeral home, in every kitchen table where someone was hurting and needed a hand to hold. He never got rich. Pastors of small community churches in the South don't get rich, but he and Edith had enough. They had the house on Magnolia Drive, built on a lot they bought before the neighborhood became exclusive, back when the street was dirt and the nearest neighbor was half a mile away. They built it themselves with help from the congregation. Harold laid the foundation. A deacon named George did the plumbing. The women of the church painted the interior. Edith planted the garden. It was a modest house then, 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, a living room with a fireplace that Harold built from stones he collected from a riverbed, a porch with a swing that Edith sat on every evening and watched the sun go down. But the neighborhood changed. The fields became lots. The lots became houses. The houses became mansions. The dirt road became Magnolia Drive. The open land became Briarwood Estates. And suddenly, the modest house that Harold and Edith had built with their own hands was surrounded by million-dollar properties and gated entrances and HOA fees and people who had arrived with money and opinions and the unshakable belief that they owned not just their houses, but the character of the entire neighborhood. The Crawfords were grandfathered in. Their house predated the development, predated the HOA, predated the gate, and the rules and the approved color palette. They existed on Magnolia Drive the way a river exists in a canyon, as the thing that was there first, the thing that shaped the landscape before the landscape decided to reshape itself. Some of the neighbors were welcoming, most were not. The Crawfords' house was the smallest on the street. Their car was the oldest. Their lawn, while tidy, was not professionally maintained. Their fence was wooden, not wrought iron. Their mailbox was standard issue, not custom designed. They were, in every visible way, different from everyone around them. But they stayed. For 47 years, they stayed, because it was their house, their home, the place where their children took their first steps and said their first words and brought home their first report cards. The place where Harold wrote his sermons at the kitchen table and Edith sang hymns while she cooked, and the lilac bush by the back door bloomed every May and filled the house with a scent that both of them agreed was the closest thing to heaven you could find on earth. Harold got sick in 2019. Alzheimer's, the cruelest disease, the one that doesn't kill your body first. It kills your mind. It takes your memories one by one, like a thief working through a house at night, stealing the things that matter most and leaving the structure standing but empty. For 3 years, Edith took care of him. She bathed him and dressed him and fed him and held his hand when he was scared, which was often because Alzheimer's is a disease of fear, the fear of forgetting, the fear of not knowing where you are or who you're with or why the face in the mirror doesn't match the person you think you are. She took care of him alone. Their children, a son in Seattle and a daughter in London, offered to help. They offered to fly in to hire caregivers to move Harold to a facility. Edith said no. She said it the way she said everything, with a quiet firmness that made further argument pointless. Took care of this church for 50 years. He took care of this community. He took care of me. I am going to take care of him, in our house, in our bed, until the end. The end came in March 2022. Harold died in his sleep, in their bed, in the house he had built with his hands. Edith was beside him. She was holding his hand. She had been holding it all night because he had been restless, and the touch of her skin was the only thing that calmed him. Even when he couldn't remember her name, even when he looked at her with the blank, frightened eyes of a man who has lost the map to his own life, he knew her hand. That was the last thing to go. Not her name, not her face, her hand, the feel of it, the warmth. The 54 years of holding it across kitchen tables and church pews and hospital beds and the front seat of a car on long drives when neither of them needed to say a word because the hands said everything. He died holding it, and Edith sat there in the dark, holding back for a long time after he was gone. The days after Harold's death were a blur of arrangements and phone calls and the mechanical, autopilot grief of a woman who has been preparing for this moment for 3 years, but is still not ready for it. She called the funeral home, she called the church, she called her children who both cried on the phone, and she comforted them because that's what mothers do, even when they're the ones who need comforting. The funeral was enormous, 400 people, standing room only. People drove from 3 states to say goodbye to a man who had married them, baptized their children, sat with them in their darkest hours, and never once made them feel like they were a burden. Edith sat in the front pew and received condolences for 4 hours. She shook every hand. She hugged every person. She thanked every person who told her that Harold had changed their life. And when it was over, when the last car had pulled out of the parking lot and the last casserole had been delivered to the kitchen, she went home to an empty house and sat in Harold's chair in the living room and listened to the silence. The silence was the worst part, worse than the grief, worse than the loneliness. The silence of a house that used to be full of a man's voice. Harold singing in the shower, Harold laughing at his own jokes, Harold praying out loud in the kitchen because he believed God could hear him better near the coffee maker. Harold calling out from the garden, "Edith, come look at this tomato," as if every tomato he grew were the first tomato anyone had ever grown. The house was so quiet that she could hear the clock in the hallway ticking. She had never noticed it before. In 54 years of living in that house, she had never heard the clock because Harold had always been louder. She tried to go on. She kept the house clean. She tended the garden. She went to church on Sundays and sat in the same pew and listened to Pastor David preach and tried to feel God the way Harold had always felt God, as a warm and constant presence, like sunlight through a window. But the sunlight felt cold now. The pew felt empty. The hymns sounded different without Harold's baritone beside her, slightly off-key, but enthusiastic, the way he did everything. The bills came next. Alzheimer's care is expensive even when you do it yourself. The medications, the adult diapers, the hospital bed that Medicare covered partially, but not fully. The modifications to the house, the ramps and the railings, and the locks on the doors to keep Harold from wandering at night. 3 years of expenses on a pastor's pension and a small Social Security check. The total when Edith sat down and added it all up, which she did on a Saturday afternoon with a calculator and a stack of receipts and the grim determination of a woman facing facts she can no longer avoid, was $147,000. $147,000 that she didn't have, never had, and had no way of earning at 80 years old with no skills that the modern economy valued. Edith had taken out a reverse mortgage on the house in 2020. It was the only way to pay for Harold's care. The bank gave her money. In exchange, the bank got the house. Not immediately, not while she was living in it, but eventually, inevitably. The math was clear. The house was collateral, and when the balance came due, it would be gone. The balance came due 14 months after Harold died. The bank sent a letter, then another letter, then a man in a suit who stood on the porch that Harold had built and explained, with the polished sympathy of someone who has delivered bad news professionally for years, that Edith had 60 days to vacate the property. 60 days. to leave the house she had lived in for 47 years, the house where she had raised her children and buried her dog and planted her garden and held her husband's hand while he died. She didn't fight it. She didn't hire a lawyer. She didn't call her children and beg for help. She didn't do any of the things that a different woman, a woman with more fight left in her, might have done, because the fight had gone out of her. 3 years of caregiving and grief had taken everything she had, and there was simply nothing left to give to a legal battle she couldn't win. She packed what she could fit in the Buick: clothes, blankets, the thermos, the handbag, a box of photographs, Harold's Bible, the pearl necklace he had given her on their 25th anniversary. She drove away from 417 Magnolia Drive on a Tuesday morning in September. She pulled over at the end of the street and sat in the car for 20 minutes, looking in the rearview mirror at the house getting smaller and smaller. And she didn't cry. She had cried enough. There was a finite amount of tears in a person, she believed, and she had used hers up in the 3 years of watching Harold disappear. Her son in Seattle offered her his guest room. Her daughter in London offered to fly her over. Friends from the church offered spare bedrooms and fold-out couches and the kind of temporary arrangements that are offered with genuine kindness, but that both parties know are not sustainable. Edith said no to all of them. She didn't want a guest room. She didn't want London. She didn't want a fold-out couch in someone else's house, someone else's life, someone else's routine. She wanted her house, her garden, her porch, her lilac bush. She wanted to sit in the car on Magnolia Drive and look at the place where her life had happened and feel, even from across the street, even through a cracked windshield, that she was still connected to it. So that's what she did. She parked on Magnolia Drive. She reclined the seat. She pulled the blanket over her legs, and she stayed. Her days had a routine. She woke at 6 when the light came through the cracked windshield and fell across her face like a benediction. She brushed her teeth with water from the thermos leaning out of the car door discreetly, the way you learn to be discreet when your private life has become public. She changed her blouse in the back seat, hidden beneath the blankets, with the practiced efficiency of a woman who has adapted to circumstances she never imagined and refuses to be humiliated by them. She ate breakfast from a cooler she kept on the floor of the passenger side: an apple, a piece of bread, a carton of yogurt when she could afford it. She ate slowly, the way she did everything now, because time was the one thing she had in abundance, and rushing felt disrespectful to it. Then she sat. She watched the house. She watched the light move across its face throughout the day, the way it caught the windows in the morning and turned them to gold, the way it fell across the garden in the afternoon and made the flowers glow. She watched the new owners come and go, the husband in his Tesla, the wife in her SUV, the children with their backpacks, and their laughter and their absolute certainty that the world was safe and permanent and theirs. She watched and she remembered. She remembered Harold painting the shutters in the August heat, shirtless, sunburned, singing off-key. She remembered her children running through the sprinklers on summer afternoons. She remembered Biscuit barking at squirrels. She remembered Christmas mornings and birthday parties and the ordinary Tuesday evenings when nothing happened, except that she and Harold sat on the porch and watched the sun go down and felt, in a way that required no analysis and no explanation, that they were exactly where they belonged. She read her book, the same book, over and over. It was a novel Harold had given her on their first anniversary, a love story. She had read it so many times that the pages were falling out and the binding was held together with a rubber band. She didn't read it for the plot. She read it because Harold had written in the margin of the last page, in his small, neat handwriting, "This is us, for always." Not because she had nowhere to go, because she had nowhere she wanted to be. Sergeant Rita Alvarez stood beside the Buick and listened to all of this. She listened without interrupting. She listened the way cops listen when they realize that the call they responded to is not what they expected, that the complaint is a person, that the problem is a story, that the solution is not in the penal code, but in the human heart. When Edith finished, Rita was quiet for a long time. She looked at the house across the street. She looked at the garden that Edith had described planting, flower by flower, over the course of 4 decades. She could see the roses along the fence, the hydrangeas by the porch, the lilac bush by the back door that even in November retained the shape and structure of something that had been loved. "Mrs. Crawford," Rita said, "I'm not going to ask you to leave." Edith looked at her, surprised. The first. genuine surprise she had shown since Rita arrived. "But I am going to ask you to let me help." "I don't need help, Sergeant. With all due respect, ma'am, you're 81 years old and you're sleeping in a car. You need help, and there's no shame in that." Edith's chin lifted slightly, the gesture of a woman who has spent a lifetime being strong and who equates needing help with weakness. The gesture of a generation that was taught to endure rather than ask, to suffer rather than impose, to carry every burden alone because asking someone else to share it was an admission of failure. "My husband never asked for help," she said. "Your husband had you," Rita replied. "Who do you have?" The question hung in the air, simple, direct, devastating. Who do you have? Not who do you know? Not who could you call? Who do you have? In the present tense, in the practical, daily, who makes sure you eat breakfast and take your medication sense. Edith didn't answer. She didn't need to. The answer was sitting in a Buick LeSabre on a street full of strangers who had signed a petition to have her towed. Rita went back to her cruiser and made 3 phone calls. The first was to the department's community liaison officer, a woman named Carla, who specialized in elder services. The second was to Grace Community Church, which was still active, and which, Rita correctly assumed, would want to know that their former pastor's widow was living in her car on the street where their pastor had lived. The third was to the HOA president, Donald Waverly, not to report on Edith's status, but to deliver, in the most professional language she could manage, a message that amounted to, "You should be ashamed of yourselves." Donald, to his credit, was ashamed. He was a retired lawyer, not a monster, and when Rita explained who the old woman in the Buick was, where she had come from, and why she was parked on Magnolia Drive, he went very quiet on the phone. Then he said, "What can we do? You can start by talking to her like a human being," which apparently nobody on this street has managed to do in 11 days. Within 24 hours, everything changed. The congregation at Grace Community Church mobilized with the efficiency and determination of people who take the concept of love thy neighbor literally rather than selectively. The current pastor, a young man named David who had been mentored by Harold 30 years ago and who still kept Harold's framed photograph on his office wall, organized a meeting the same evening Rita called. 40 people showed up, former members of the congregation, current members, people who had been married by Harold, people whose children had been baptized by Harold, people who had sat in his office and cried and been held and comforted by a man who never turned anyone away. They raised $11,000 in the first hour, not from wealthy donors, from ordinary people, from nurses and teachers and mechanics and retirees who pulled money from savings accounts and cookie jars and the envelopes they kept in kitchen drawers for emergencies. Because this was an emergency. Their pastor's wife was sleeping in a car, and in their understanding of the world, that was a failure, not of Edith Crawford, but of every person who had ever benefited from Harold Crawford's kindness and had not been paying attention. A woman named Lorraine Jackson, who was 73 years old and who had been the church organist for 40 years, stood up at the meeting and said something that nobody forgot. "Harold Crawford sat with my husband every night for 2 weeks when he was dying of cancer. Every night. After a full day of pastoring, he drove to our house and sat in a chair next to George's bed and held his hand and read scripture and told him he was loved. For 2 weeks, without being asked, without expecting anything in return." She paused. Her voice was shaking, but her eyes were steady. "That man's wife is sleeping in a car. In a car. And we're sitting here drinking coffee like this is a committee meeting. This is not a committee meeting. This is a test. And we better not fail it." Nobody drank any more coffee that evening. The apartment at the church was transformed in 48 hours. A crew of volunteers organized by Lorraine with the efficiency of a woman who had been running church potlucks for 4 decades, cleaned the space, painted the walls a soft cream color, installed new light fixtures, and furnished every room with donated items that were not hand-me-downs but genuinely nice things that people brought from their own homes because they wanted Edith to have something beautiful. A retired carpenter named Ray built a bookshelf along one wall of the living room, custom fitted to the space. with enough room for Harold's Bible and Edith's book collection and the box of photographs that she carried everywhere. A woman from the quilting circle made a quilt for the bed, pieced together from fabric squares that each member of the circle had contributed, so that every time Edith pulled it over herself, she was wrapped in the collective care of people who loved her. And someone, Rita never found out who, had hung curtains in the living room that were almost exactly the same shade of blue that Edith had chosen for the house on Magnolia Drive in 1975. It was either an extraordinary coincidence or an act of attention so specific and so loving that it bordered on the miraculous. David went to Magnolia Drive the next morning. He brought coffee and a bag of pastries from the bakery that Harold had visited every Saturday for 30 years. He knocked on the window of the Buick, and when Edith saw his face, she recognized him immediately. The boy who had been 12 years old when Harold took him under his wing. The teenager who had mowed the Crawfords' lawn every summer. The young man who had stood in the pulpit at Harold's funeral and delivered a eulogy that made 400 people weep. "Pastor David," Edith said, and for the first time since she had parked on Magnolia Drive, her voice wavered. "Mrs. Crawford, I came to take you home." "I don't have a home. You do now." The church had a small apartment attached to the fellowship hall. It had been built as a residence for visiting pastors, but had been used mostly for storage. In the 48 hours since Rita's phone call, the congregation had cleared it out, painted the walls, furnished it with donated furniture, stocked the kitchen, and hung curtains that Edith would later recognize as almost exactly the same shade of blue that she had chosen for the house on Magnolia Drive in 1975. It wasn't the house, it wasn't the garden or the porch or the lilac bush, but it was warm and clean and safe, and it was in the building where Harold had preached for 50 years. Which meant that some part of him was there, embedded in the walls and the floors and the stained glass windows that caught the morning light and threw colored patterns across the sanctuary. Edith moved in on a Friday. She brought her suitcase and her box of photographs and Harold's Bible and the thermos and the pearl necklace. David carried the suitcase for her. Lorraine carried the box of photographs. Two deacons carried a rocking chair that someone had donated because word had gotten around that Edith liked to sit and rock. And within the church community, the idea of Edith Crawford not having a rocking chair was treated as a crisis on par with a roof leak or a broken furnace. She stood in the doorway of the apartment and looked at it for a long time. She looked at the blue curtains. She looked at the donated couch, which was nicer than any couch she and Harold had ever owned. She looked at the bookshelf that Ray had built, with its clean lines and smooth finish, and the small cross that he had carved into the top corner, because Ray was a carpenter who believed that everything he built should have a piece of God in it. She looked at the kitchen, which someone had stocked with Earl Grey tea and honey, and the particular brand of wheat bread that she had been buying for 40 years, which meant that someone had paid attention. Someone had noticed what she ate. Someone had cared enough to remember. She walked to the window. Through it, she could see the stained glass of the sanctuary, the same stained glass that Harold had stood beneath for 50 years, delivering sermons about love and grace and the stubborn, impractical, unreasonable kindness that God asks of people who claim to believe in Him. She pressed her hand against her chest and felt something move inside her that had been still for a very long time. Not joy. Not yet. Something before joy. Something that makes joy possible. She felt held, not by arms, by community, by the accumulated kindness of 40 years of her husband's ministry, coming back to her now when she needed it most, like interest on a deposit that had been made decades ago. The neighbors on Magnolia Drive heard about it. Of course they did. The same group text that had generated outrage and petitions now carried a different kind of message. Someone shared the story, the real story. Not the story of a vagrant in a rusted car, but the story of Edith and Harold Crawford, the house they built, the church they served, the garden she planted, the 54 years of marriage, the Alzheimer's, the reverse mortgage, the 60 days. The messages changed. I had no idea. I feel terrible. I signed that petition. Why didn't anyone just talk to her? We should do something. Craig Fullerton, the man who had drafted the petition and called the police, read the messages and sat in his kitchen for a long time, staring at the wall. His wife found him there an hour later, still staring, and asked him what was wrong. I called the cops on an 81-year-old pastor's wife who was sleeping in her car because she lost her house taking care of her husband with Alzheimer's, he said. His wife looked at him. I know, he said. The next morning, Craig Fullerton did something that surprised everyone who knew him, including himself. He knocked on the door of 417 Magnolia Drive. The house had been purchased by a couple named the Langs, Michael and Jennifer Lang, mid-40s. He was in finance. She was a consultant. They had 2 children, Sophie, who was 9, and Kate, who was 7, and a golden retriever named Barkley, who had chewed through 3 couches and was working on the 4th. They had moved to Charlotte from Boston 2 years ago for Michael's job, and they had bought 417 Magnolia Drive because the real estate agent said it had good bones and great natural light, and they had fallen in love with the garden. They had never thought about where the garden came from. They had never wondered who had planted the roses along the fence, or the hydrangeas by the porch, or the lilac bush by the back door. They had assumed it was landscaping, the same way they assumed the floors and the walls and the fireplace were construction, things that existed because someone had paid for them, not because someone had loved them into being. They had renovated the house extensively, adding a home office and a media room and a chef's kitchen with an island the size of a small boat. They had pulled up the original hardwood floors in the living room and replaced them with engineered bamboo. They had torn out Harold's handmade kitchen cabinets and installed custom ones from a designer in Asheville. They had painted over the walls that the women of the church had painted in 1974 with a shade called agreeable gray that the designer said was timeless. They didn't know any of this was significant. They didn't know the floors were laid by a pastor. They didn't know the cabinets were built by a deacon named George. They didn't know the walls had been painted by women who brought their own brushes and their own lunch and sang hymns while they worked. They didn't know because nobody had told them, and they hadn't asked because in the real estate transaction that had delivered this house to them, there was no line item for history, no disclosure form for love. Craig stood on the porch that Harold Crawford had built with his own hands and rang the bell. Michael Lang opened the door. "I need to tell you something about this house," Craig said. He told them everything he had learned from the group text and from Rita Alvarez and from the church about Harold and Edith, about the 47 years, about the garden and the lilac bush and the dog buried under the maple tree, about the Alzheimer's and the reverse mortgage and the Buick on the street and the petition and the police. Michael Lang listened. Jennifer, who had come to the door behind him, listened. Their children, who were doing homework at the kitchen island, listened. Even the golden retriever, who had been sleeping on the couch, raised his head and seemed to listen, the way dogs do when they sense that something important is happening. When Craig finished, Michael was quiet for a long time. He looked around the kitchen, at the custom cabinets, at the bamboo floors, at the granite countertops, and the stainless steel appliances, and all the expensive, tasteful, carefully selected elements that he and Jennifer had installed over the past 2 years. And for the first time, he saw them for what they were: a layer, a surface, a covering laid over the real house, the original house, the house that 2 people had built with borrowed tools and volunteer labor, and the kind of love that doesn't show up on a renovation budget. "She was parked outside our house for 11 days, Michael said, "and nobody told us why. Nobody knew why. Nobody asked." "That's worse." Michael looked at Jennifer. Jennifer looked at Michael. Something passed between them. The kind of wordless communication that happens in marriages where both people share the same values, even if those values have never been tested. "We'd like to meet her," Jennifer said. They drove to the church together, Craig and Michael and Jennifer, in Craig's white Lexus, which he had not washed that week for the first time in recent memory, because suddenly the cleanliness of his car seemed like the least important thing in the world. They found Edith in the apartment, sitting in a chair by the window, reading the same paperback she had been reading in the Buick. She looked up when they came in and studied them with those sharp, clear eyes. Michael spoke first. He introduced himself. He told Edith that he and Jennifer had bought 417 Magnolia Drive 2 years ago. He told her that they hadn't known its history, that they hadn't known about her or Harold or the church or any of it. "We just saw a house for sale," he said. "We didn't see a home." Edith looked at him. "There's a difference." "Yes, ma'am, there is." He told her that they wanted her to know she was welcome to visit any time, that the garden was still there, mostly, though the new landscaping company had replaced some of the plants, that the lilac bush by the back door was still blooming every May, that they had found the stone where the dog was buried under the maple tree and had left it undisturbed. Edith's eyes filled. She didn't try to stop the tears. She was 81 years old, and she had earned every tear. His name was Biscuit, she said. The dog. Harold named him. He was a terrible dog, chewed everything, dug up the garden, barked at the mailman every single day for 12 years. But Harold loved him. Harold loved everything. Jennifer knelt beside Edith's chair and took her hand. The gesture was instinctive, unrehearsed, the kind of thing you do when words fail and touch is all that's left. Mrs. Crawford, would you like to come home? Edith looked at her. Home? To the house. We want you to see it, to see that it's still your house, even if the deed has a different name. The walls you chose, the floors Harold laid, the garden you planted, it's all still there. Edith went. She sat in the back seat of the Lexus and watched the streets she had known for half a century roll past the window. When they pulled into the driveway of 417 Magnolia Drive, she didn't get out immediately. She sat in the car and looked at the house through the windshield, the way she had looked at it from the Buick, but closer now, close enough to see the details. The red door was still red. The shutters were still white. The porch was still there, though the swing was gone, replaced by two modern chairs that didn't match the style of the house, but that Edith decided not to mention. The roses were still along the fence, though they had been trimmed differently, more aggressively, than Edith would have preferred. The hydrangeas were blooming, and the lilac bush, the one by the back door, the one that Harold had planted the year they moved in because Edith said she couldn't live in a house without lilacs, was tall and full and exactly where it had always been. She got out of the car. She walked up the path. She stood on the porch and put her hand on the door frame, the same door frame that Harold had installed in 1974, and she felt the wood under her fingers, and she felt the years, and she felt the grief and the love and the loss and the memory of a man who had stood in this same spot 1,000 times and called out, "Edith, I'm home." She went inside. The rooms were different. The furniture was different. The colors were different. The kitchen had been transformed into something from a magazine, all granite and stainless steel and recessed lighting. But the bones were the same. The layout Harold had designed, the fireplace he had built from river stones, the window in the living room that faced east, where the morning sun came through and made patterns on the floor that Edith used to lie on with Biscuit, both of them stretched out like cats, warming themselves in the light. She walked through every room. She touched the walls. She stood in the doorways. She went to the backyard and found the maple tree and the stone that marked Biscuit's grave, and she stood there for a long time, her hand on the rough bark of the tree, feeling the solidity of something that had been alive when Harold was alive, that had grown while he grew old, that was still growing now, still reaching upward, still alive. Jennifer came out and stood beside her. "We could put the swing back on the porch," Jennifer said, "if you'd like." Edith looked at her. "You don't have to do that. I know, but I'd like to, and I think the porch misses it." Edith almost smiled. Almost. The muscles of her face moved in that direction but stopped short, as if they had forgotten the final step. But the intention was there. The warmth was there. "Harold would have liked you," she said. The Langs put the swing back on the porch. They bought one that matched the style of the house because Jennifer researched porch swings for an unreasonable amount of time until she found one that looked like it had always been there. They invited Edith to come sit on it anytime she wanted. They gave her a key to the side gate so she could visit the garden without ringing the bell. Edith came every Wednesday and Saturday. She sat on the swing. She tended the garden. She pruned the roses and talked to the hydrangeas and checked on the lilac bush, the way a mother checks on a grown child, making sure it was healthy, making sure it was thriving, making sure it remembered where it came from. She taught Jennifer how to garden, real gardening, not the kind you hire a company for. She showed her how to test the soil with her fingers, how to know when a plant was thirsty and when it was drowning, how to prune roses so they come back stronger, how to talk to plants, which Jennifer found absurd at first and then found herself doing when nobody was looking, because Edith swore it worked and the evidence was hard to argue with. She taught Michael how to fix things, small things, a loose board on the porch, a dripping faucet, a squeaky hinge, the things that Harold had always fixed himself, without tools or manuals or YouTube tutorials, just instinct and patience, and the understanding that a house is not a machine. It's a living thing. It breathes and settles and shifts and creaks, and if you listen to it, it will tell you what it needs. Michael, who had never held a hammer in his life, who had hired contractors for everything from hanging pictures to changing light bulbs, found himself spending Saturday mornings on the porch with Edith, learning to sand and paint and repair the small imperfections that time inflicts on everything it touches. He discovered that he liked it, that there was something meditative about working with his hands, that the physical act of fixing a loose board was more satisfying than anything he did in his office, where the problems were abstract and the solutions were spreadsheets, and nobody ever got to hold the finished product in their hands and say, "I made this. I fixed this. This is better because I was here." The Lang children, Sophie and Kate, adopted her immediately and completely. They called her Grandma Edith within a week. They brought her drawings they made at school. They showed her their report cards. They sat on the porch swing with her and ate cookies and asked her to tell them stories about the house. And Edith told them about Harold and Biscuit and the time the fireplace backed up and filled the living room with smoke, and Harold had to carry the Christmas tree out the front door while it was still on fire, and the whole neighborhood came out to watch, and everyone laughed so hard that they forgot it was a disaster. She told them about the blizzard of 1996 when the power went out for 3 days, and Harold built a fort out of couch cushions in front of the fireplace, and they roasted marshmallows and told ghost stories, and their children, who were teenagers, by then and normally too cool for family activities, crawled into the fort and fell asleep beside their parents like they were little again. She told them about the day Harold proposed, on the bridge over the creek in the park where they had their first date, with a ring he had bought on layaway for 6 months. And when he got down on one knee, the ring fell out of his hand and rolled through the boards of the bridge and into the creek below. And he jumped in after it, in his good suit, in November, and came up soaking wet and grinning with the ring between his teeth. The girls loved these stories. They asked for them again and again, the way children do with their favorite stories, and Edith told them again and again, the way grandmothers do with their favorite memories. And with each telling, the house absorbed the stories. The walls heard them, the floors felt them, and 417 Magnolia Drive, which had been a house for 2 years, slowly, imperceptibly began to become a home again. Craig Fullerton, the man who had drafted the petition, became an unlikely ally. The guilt of what he had done, of having tried to remove an 81-year-old woman from a street she had lived on before he was born, transformed into something productive. He organized a neighborhood fund to help Edith with her expenses. He got the HOA to waive any future complaints about her visits. He personally repaired the gate at the entrance to Briarwood Estates, the broken gate that had been the subject of so much complaint, and he did it on a Saturday morning, in his good clothes, because he couldn't be bothered to change, and because fixing something broken felt more important than keeping his pants clean. He never apologized to Edith directly. He didn't know how, but he showed up every Wednesday when she was at the garden and helped her carry the heavy pots, and knelt beside her in the dirt, and pulled weeds, and listened to her talk about Harold and the church and the old days. And Edith, who had been reading people for 81 years and could spot insincerity the way a jeweler spots a fake diamond, accepted his presence without comment, because she understood that some apologies don't come in words. They come in action, in showing up, in kneeling in the dirt beside someone and pulling weeds because it's the only language you have. Rita Alvarez checked in on Edith once a month. She came in civilian clothes on her day off, and they drank Earl Grey tea in the apartment by the church and talked about Harold and the neighborhood and the Buick, which was still parked at the church because Edith couldn't bear to sell it. It was the last thing she and Harold had shared, the car they had driven to doctor's appointments and grocery stores and the pharmacy and the church and all the other ordinary destinations that make up a life. "You know what the funny thing is?" Edith said once during one of these visits. "What's that?" Harold would have forgiven them, the neighbors, the petition, the police call, all of it. He would have said they were scared, and scared people do foolish things. And the Christian thing to do is forgive them and move on. She took a sip of tea. "I'm not as good a Christian as Harold. It took me a little longer." Rita smiled. "How long?" Edith thought about it. "About 3 cups of tea and a porch swing." Rita laughed. Edith laughed too. It was a small laugh, rusty, unpracticed, but real. Edith May Crawford lived in the apartment at Grace Community Church for the rest of her life. She visited the house on Magnolia Drive twice a week. She tended the garden. She sat on the porch swing. She told stories to Sophie and Kate. She drank tea with Rita. She let Craig pull weeds beside her. She carried Harold's Bible everywhere she went and read from it every evening before bed, not because she needed to find God, but because the margins were full of Harold's handwriting, tiny notes he had made over 50 years of study, and reading them was like hearing his voice. She died on a Tuesday morning in May. The lilacs were in bloom. The nurses at the hospice said she had been peaceful, that she had smiled in her sleep, that she had been holding something in her hand when she passed. It was a key, the key to the side gate at 417 Magnolia Drive. The funeral was held at Grace Community Church. 400 people came, more than had come for Harold's funeral, which would have made Harold laugh, because he always said Edith was the more popular one. The Lang family sat in the second row. Craig Fullerton sat in the fourth, wearing a suit that fit properly this time. Rita Alvarez stood in the back, in her uniform because she was on duty, but there was no way she was missing this. Donald Waverly, the HOA president, sat in the fifth row and stared at his hands for most of the service. Lorraine Jackson played the organ. She played Amazing Grace, which had been Harold's favorite hymn. And then she played What a Wonderful World, which had been Edith's. And the combination of the sacred and the secular, the church hymn and the jazz standard, felt exactly right. It felt like Edith. A woman who loved God and loved life and didn't see any contradiction between the two. Sophie and Kate sat between their parents. Sophie cried quietly. Kate held a drawing she had made of Grandma Edith in the garden, surrounded by flowers, with a yellow sun and a blue sky, and the lilac bush rendered in purple crayon so thick that it left marks on the pew. Pastor David delivered the eulogy. He talked about Harold and Edith, about the house they built and the church they served and the 54 years they spent together, about a woman who slept in a car because she couldn't bear to be separated from the place where her love had lived, about a neighborhood that failed her and then, slowly, imperfectly, found its way back. Edith Crawford didn't need a mansion, David said. She didn't need a gated community or a landscaping service or an HOA-approved mailbox. She needed a garden and a porch swing, and the knowledge that somewhere in the world, the lilac bush she planted with her husband was still blooming. He paused. She taught us something, all of us. She taught us that a house is not a home, that a home is not an address, that a home is the place where someone you love planted a lilac bush, and the smell of it in May makes you feel like everything is going to be all right. The Langs kept the garden. They kept the porch swing. They kept the side gate with its key, and they hung a small plaque beside it that said, Edith's Garden, in loving memory of Harold and Edith Crawford, who built this house with their hands and filled it with their hearts. And every May, when the lilac bush blooms, Sophie and Kate cut a branch and bring it inside and put it in a vase on the kitchen counter. They don't know why exactly. They just know that Grandma Edith loved lilacs, and that the smell of them fills the house with something that feels like love and memory and the particular kind of warmth that comes from knowing you are standing in a place where good people lived. The car is still parked at the church. Nobody has moved it. The burgundy paint is fading further. The crack in the windshield is wider. The blankets are still in the back seat. Nobody has moved it because nobody wants to, because the car is not a car anymore. It's a monument, a testament, a reminder that on a street full of million-dollar homes and luxury cars and perfectly manicured lawns, the most valuable thing was a 1997 Buick LeSabre with rust spots on the fenders and an old woman inside who loved a house so much that she couldn't leave. And the most shameful thing was that nobody asked her why, until someone did. And everything changed, because that's all it takes. One person, one question, one moment of paying attention to the human being in front of you instead of the problem they represent. Are you all right? Is there anything I can do? 7 words. That's all it took. 7 words. And a street full of strangers became a neighborhood. That's the story. An old woman, a rusted car, a street that looked away for 11 days, and then, finally, looked back. It's not a perfect story. The neighbors failed. The system failed. The bank took a house from an 81-year-old widow, and nobody intervened. The petition was written and signed and submitted before a single person thought to knock on a car window and ask a simple question. But it's also a story about what happens after the failure, about the cop who chose compassion over procedure, about the church that mobilized overnight, about the family who opened their door and their home and their hearts to a stranger who turned out to be the most important person who had ever lived in their house. About the man who wrote the petition and then knelt in the dirt to pull weeds as penance. It's a story about the space between what we should have done and what we eventually did, and about the grace that lives in that space, if we're brave enough to look for it. Edith Crawford is buried next to Harold in the cemetery behind Grace Community Church. Their headstone is simple, gray granite, 2 names, 2 dates, and an inscription that Harold had chosen years before he died, from a verse he had preached on more times than anyone could count. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And underneath, in smaller letters, added after Edith's passing at the request of Sophie and Kate Lang, who were 14 and 12 by then, and who still remembered every story Grandma Edith had ever told them on the porch swing at 417 Magnolia Drive. The lilacs are still blooming.